Assalamu alaikum. As discussed earlier, we'll try to bring in all the different approaches we have seen so far of narratological approaches, that is, and try to analyze one single text, one single story. All right. So we've already seen the oval portrait, Edgar Allan Poe's oval portrait from Barthian perspective. We'll try to approach it through Propian, Genetian, and Aristotelian perspective in this section. All right. So I believe you all remember the oval portrait, the story, at least the gist of the oval portrait. How there is this wounded officer who finds himself in a chateau and a very opulent, a chateau, and there how he comes across this one book that records in detail the all the works that are all the paintings that are hung on the walls, all the paintings made by an artist, and how there's this one a single painting of a very beautiful woman, that is a very lifelike portrait of a very beautiful woman, whose story the book relates, right? So the story goes something like that the painter, the artist himself, is a bridegroom and she's the bride, and he tries to capture her in his art with his talent, right? And as he puts life into the work, into the portrait, the life out of the bride seeps out of her, right? And it seems to be revolving around a sort of a moral dilemma, wherein there is a struggle between art and life, right? And yes, we saw it at different levels, how there is a reflection of the narratives, the two kinds of narratives, they seem to be two blocks of narratives, and how they seem to reflect each other, how one seems to or sometimes run contrary to each other. We've seen it through deconstruction, um, how the opposing sides, how there is certain disunity. We've seen it from the structuralist perspective, how there is a certain unity in both narratives, right? Now here, basically, as far as the plot is concerned, plot would deal with in a sort of chronological order. Now here it is presented in a reverse chronological order. Reverse chronological order as in the thing that happened, the events that happened earlier is related to us last, right? So it is the wounded officer that is very much nearer to the present time. His story is first related to us, and the book seems to be the link from which we are taken further back to the point when the artist and his wife lived, right? So but then see, if you can imagine the chronology of the events taking place related to us as it is, the effect would be very different, right? So these two blocks, what you call, what Peter Barry calls blocks of narratives, he calls them the primary or the frame narrative and the embedded or secondary narrative. You could call it a meta narrative or embedded narrative or secondary narrative. So primary narrative would be the part concerning the wounded officer, and the secondary or embedded narrative would be the part concerning the circumstances of the portrait, how the portrait was made, when, and what was its very traumatic and disastrous consequence of creating that portrait. So now we have these technical terms to describe what was mentioned more straightforwardly as story within the story. Okay. Now when you look at it, these two narratives, there is the prime narrative and the embedded narrative, are unusually balanced. Okay, unusually balanced as in generally the frame narrative, that is the narrative that contains the embedded narrative, is supposed to be very insignificant comparatively speaking. Okay, it should not mean much, it should not hog the limelight. All right. Now what happens here is that the frame narrative is sort of like, there is a kind of implied equivalence between them. Implied equivalence as in they're not equal, but there is a certain equivalence in them. There is a certain kind of like, the wounded officer, you know the sorry, excuse me, the wounded and officer has a certain connection, or sort of like, it's a sort of a resonance of what the what the woman signifies, right? The woman in the portrait signifies. She too was wounded, though the wound is internal, whereas the wound of the officer is external and he is recuperating. The wound within this bride, this woman, is internal and is festering, and it festers to the point that it leeches the life out of her, right? So there is a kind of equivalence here. Again, or the valet of the, I mean, and again, you see there is a kind of binary here. Both, there are two characters in the frame narrative, there are two characters in the embedded narrative. Again, there is a kind of power struggle between between the officer and the valet, and there was a power struggle between the bride and the groom, right? And of course, if you look at the subsequent events, while the officer, at least the implication is that the officer does recuperate at some point. Recuperate as in his wound heals and he gets healthy at some point. The woman here, the woman in the portrait, the woman here, ultimately a healthy woman, ultimately dies, right? So there is a kind of balance, unusual balance, though, because unusual balance, because the frame narrative is supposed to be of an insignificant nature, generally speaking, okay? But here there is an unusual balance here, okay? So now, again, there is Peter Barry feels that this particular idea, that the first part of the setting is a whole country which has been ravaged by a mistaken pursuit of some ideal. I mean, ideals are all well and good, but when you pursue those ideals, what happens, what the consequences are, nobody really gives thought to initially, right? It's only aftermath, it is only after the fact that people realize that so much had to be sacrificed, so many things had to be sacrificed to pursue those ideals. So a mistaken ideal, in pursuit of some mistaken pursuit of some ideal, what so much the whole country has been ravaged. So there is a kind of large scale equivalent of what we see in the embedded narrative. So what happens in the embedded narrative is there is a pursuit of an ideal was the art that is like the quest for perfecting the portrait, right? So there is a quest for there's a pursuit of perfection, pursuit for the mistaken ideal, all right, in the cause of which the life of this one person, one human, is lost. So there is a larger implication that in the quest for perfection, in the quest of ideal, of a certain ideal, a civil war, probably, wars are wars are waged for what purpose, for what reason? Because you have some quest, some goal, some ideal in your head, and you go move towards it ideal. You with you approach it with a kind of fanatic attitude, or fanatic idealism, right? And you believe that you can die for it. So a single person dying is one thing, but uh, sacrificing an entire country for the sake of some mistaken goal is another question entirely. So so you see, there are various levels of understanding, and the frame narrative and embedded narrative seem to be resonating, of the ideas of one resonating over to the other and further on. So this raises the issue of what the frame is actually for, and answers by saying that it is a way of giving resonance and wider applicability to the themes of the embedded narrative. Okay, it gives a sort of like, it sort of sets the mood for what is to come in the embedded narrative. It tries to resonate and give wider applicability to whatever the themes are that are going to be shown in the embedded narrative. And it's also a delaying device is in where it sets the mood for the or an atmosphere for the actual story, or that is a main story. The main story here would be the embedded narrative, right? So if you look at it from a Propian perspective, as in like a folk tale, you will find different motives conflating together. Different motives as in, see, uh, for instance, if you are looking at it from as a folk tale or a fairy tale, the generic conventions would have dispensed with a frame, and the story would begin. There was once a young and talented artist. Again, the effect would be very different. So the frame we can also add here is open-ended. We don't go back to the officer and valley at the end, so that the story ends with the climactic moment of the artist realizing that his wife is dead. So a double-ended frame would risk dissipating the dramatic impact of this. As in, see, if we were to go back to the officer and find him getting well, and like his idea or his impression of this embedded narrative, it would steal away from the uh, main narrative, as in the dramatic effect, the dramatic impact created by the death of the bride, right? So now the Propian material, as far as the story is concerned, you'll find a couple of motives that seem to come together. Okay, one motive is where there is a princess and she is being captured by an ogre or a villain, and she is imprisoned in a tower and perhaps incapacitated or paralyzed or put to sleep by some magical agent. Subsequently, she is discovered and rescued by a hero who then marries her. Thus, that could be one motive. The other motive of this tale would be the Bluebeard myth. Bluebeard myth, as in it's actually a myth wherein a person who actually marries, keeps marrying, and he is kind of a serial killer, okay, who marries every time he comes across a young girl. He marries her and kills her, imprisons her in his dungeon or in his cellar or whatever. Okay, so this Bluebeard myth is at play here of the suitor who is actually a serial monogamist. Okay, serial monogamist and a serial killer. Monogamist as in he can have only one wife, and every time he marries he kills that person, right, with the bodies of previous brides stored in the dungeon. So it is a recurring motif, a very famous motif in many of the fairy tales. Okay, so in Poe's Tale 2, the bridegroom is already married, having already a bride in his art. Okay, so it seems like he is a monogamist and he cannot abide the presence of another bride. Okay, and is about to kill his bride. So with the kind of conflating of roles mentioned by Robert Scholes, hero and villain are the same figures here. All right, there are different motives. At the same time, the hero and villain are same, and the magical agency is the art here. Okay, so just as a magical agent something a magical agent is created, is acquired by the hero to enhance life. Here the magical agent is what is being used to destroy life. All right, so here the magical agent is art itself. All right, now turning to Janet's categories, first we can say that the primary and embedded narratives are mainly mimetic. Mimetic, but to what extent? See, in the primary narrative, we don't see much of what happens. I mean, we do get to see quite a bit, but then we are given, it is mostly mid-mimetic. Mid-mimetic as in it is partially mimetic. We are given a certain impression of the chateau where this person goes in to take refuge, but at the same time, it is not entirely completely mimetic. We're not given every single detail, right? So there is a kind of it's a certain degree of generality maintained here. Again, so see, there are a couple of examples given here, as in how the valet, for instance, ventured to make forcible entrance. Forcible entrance is mentioned here, but we are not exactly told in what way he forced entry into the place, right? We are not told exactly what tool he used, or did he, did he bang on it, or did he just shoulder through it, or did he use something specifically, right? We're not given, the entire full mimesis is not possible here, not seen here. Again, from the description of the room, we are told that it is decorated in rich yet tattered and antique. The decorations are rich, tattered and antique, but we are not specifically told what exactly those decorations are. We're not exactly told how they position, what is kept in which place. No, it is mildly mimetic. Okay, mildly mimetic, as in we get to see, but only see to some extent. Again, so this goes from being mildly mimetic to partial mimetic to complete mimetic, as in when the entire focus is on the narrator, that is the officer. It becomes once it just moves, it moves in a pace. The pace sort of increases from being mild to partial to fully mimetic. The same goes on with the embedded narrative as well. There is a sort of a sense of all the artwork displayed in the room. Then a general sense of it probably looks like it's been written, the book has been written by a connoisseur of art or an art critic. But then it moves on from being general to a little specific to the to a fully mimetic mode. Now again, as far as the focalization is concerned, the two narratives, the first the frame, the frame narrative is first person homodiegetic, as in it is told to us by an overt or dramatized narrator who has a distinct personality. So we are told who the officer is, what he is doing here. We get to know some personal information about him. So it is homodiegetic. Okay, it's about the officer himself, from the officer himself. Okay, it is first person homodiegetic. It is about himself. It's life story, and he is a central character in his narrative. He is educated. He knows the 18th century good. So we do get some idea of who the officer is, even though we are not sure about his name. We don't know his name. Other than that, his inclination towards painting, at least he gets he seems to have some awareness of what paintings what art is, right? A degree of interest is created, right? And as far as the embedded narrative is concerned, it is it's like it is a kind of an omniscient narrator probably, and it is sort of and he it is heterodiegetic, and the voice is heterodiegetic in the sense the story is not about the narrator of the embedded narrative. Please remember that. So in the frame narrative, it is homodiegetic because it is the story of the wounded officer himself, the frame narrative. In the embedded narrative, the story is not about himself but of someone else. This person knew at some point, possibly, or at some later date, he got some source of information, right? So it could be an omniscient narrator, or probably a heterodiegetic narrator. Okay. Now, this brings us to that underlying Aristotelian level. So first of all, we look at the hamartia. Hamartia will be the sin or fault which motors the whole story. Is of course the moral blindness of the talented artist. Now the artist is talented, but he is morally blind. So that is his fatal flaw. Fatal to his wife. Fatal to his moral character. Now he elevates himself because of this blindness to this godlike status of taking in giving life. Okay, taking on the role of creating life, but being able to do so only at the expense of life. So he can create life, he believes he can create life only when he can take life out of an actual living human being. He lacks both insight, knowledge of himself, and foresight, being unable to see the inevitable outcome of his creative obsessions. So he doesn't, neither does he have insight. Okay, insight as in he does not have any clear sight of his own moral imbalance, his own moral flaw. Nor does he have any foresight, as in he cannot predict as in what would happen if he went on the way he was in, right? He lacks both insight and foresight, and being unable to see the inevitable outcome of his creative obsessions. He also, as an artist, he ought to have some empathy for the creation. He ought to have some imagination. He lacks both. Unfortunately, he lacks both. So he cannot reproduce the real thing, but only a simulacrum, a resemblance, a kind of spooky hologram from which the essence of the person is quite absent. So even though the portrait is lifelike, it is not real, right? So the real life has been leached away at the expense of what? At the expense of creating a simulacrum of the real thing. So the moment of recognition or anagnorisis comes very late. That is after he never has a thought she is dying, only the belated perception that she is dead, right? So this anagnorisis is belated and of course unproductive. And the peripeteia or switch in fortune is perhaps relevant to both characters, for the male figure changes from being an artist of high renown and becomes a vampiric murderer, while the woman is at first a kind of embodiment of the energies of life force itself, and then becomes the meekly yielding victim whose erotic appeal consists of listlessly allowing her life to be drained away. All right. So this movement, or this switch in fortune, what Aristotle calls peripeteia, is not physical. Okay, it's sort of a psychological thing, or it's more of a philosophical perception. Instead of merely being, he is a renowned artist. He is at a high strata. This artist is at a high level where he is a renowned artist of great talent. At the end, towards the end of the embedded narrative, he turns into a vampire who thrives on the life of his victim's blood. A vampire feeds on its victim's bloods, right? So he is thrown to this one, really the lowest level possible, wherein he feeds on his victims, right? And this woman, who is again, she is so full of life in the beginning, all life is leached out of her towards the end, and she herself listlessly allows herself to be used and her life drained away. So approaching the story through these mainly technical narratological categories seems to open up new avenues, which do indeed suggest how meanings are constructed in narratives. At the same time, it's having the spin-off bonus of giving us new ideas about this particular tale and its well-born thematic territory of the conflict and contrast between the claims of life and the claims of art. So Peter Barry sums it up saying that different approaches basically give you different angles to look at, right? Different angles to look at, so that you do not miss any point in any narratological sequence, whether it be physical or psychological or philosophical or moral. You look at it, or structural for that matter, you don't get to miss out any part of it, any angle of it, right? So you can apply it to any of the text. You can pick up your own text, any a text of your choice, and try to apply some of these concepts, some of props functions, or some of Janet's questions, and try to apply those to your text, a text of your choice, and see what inference, what you can infer from it, right? Thank you so much for your patient listening. Inshallah, very soon we'll try to begin with psychoanalytic criticism. All right, psychoanalysis criticism and feminist criticism. These are the only two chapters left. Inshallah, we'll try to do them justice in shorter time as possible. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Jazakallah khair. Allah Hafiz.